Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another webinar from TUC Education. I'm Anna, and I'm delighted to be joined by Sally Leech from Henpicked. I'll get her to introduce herself properly in a second. But just welcome to everyone who is either a new attendee or welcome back to those of you who've joined us before. I'll run through our usual housekeeping. We've got live captions on the webinar, which is the green button is below the video screen. So please click that if you want to follow along with the captions. We can see that there's already several hundred of you online and chatting in the panel on the right. So please continue to do that. Tell us where you're from, and please use it to exchange any tips or ideas you might have. Sally and I will also be putting some questions to you later on in the webinar. You'll see that we've got a poll running at the bottom of the screen. There's a little pop-up panel. If you click the polls button, please vote in that. We've just asked a multiple choice question with a few answers. So please tell us what you think of that poll. And if you've got any questions for Sally, you can post them in the Ask a Question panel, which is along the bottom of the screen as well. What's a bit different with this webinar is we will be awarding everyone who attends live a digital credential to say that you have attended this. We'll email it to you following the session, and it will contain information about what you've learned on the session, what Sally talked about, and you'll be able to share that with your union colleagues, with your employer, to say what you've learned today. And we think it's really important that we recognise that you've attended this learning. And yes, finally, we will be recording this session as always, and we will send a link to the recording to anyone who's registered, along with a list of resources that we talk about today. So, as I said, I'm joined by Sally Leech from Henpicked. So first of all, Sally, can you just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about Henpicked, please?
Absolutely. I'm really delighted to be here, Anna, and it's lovely. I can see so many introductions in the chat already going, which is wonderful. So I'm the training director at Henpicked Menopause in the Workplace, and our organisation is all about supporting organisations in opening up this conversation. So looking at ways that we can support through training, through education, through resources, and helping organisations to understand the benefits of becoming menopause friendly and how the best ways of going about doing that.
That's great, Sally. Thank you. So I've got a bunch of questions that I'm going to put to you today, and I'm sure we're all going to learn loads. So first question from me: why do we need to talk about menopause at work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think in particular, when we're trying to influence organisations that this is a priority, the why is really important. And we'll come on to a little bit more detail later on. But initially, it's thinking about the context of where menopause comes, in particular in working life. We're all living and working for much longer. The average age of reaching menopause is around 51. And we have an average life expectancy around 83 and a 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 chance of living to be 100. So where historically menopause may have been associated with old age, towards the end of life, it's now kind of much more of a midway point. And if we think about those average ages, this means this is when it's often quite a critical point in people's career. People have a huge amount of knowledge and experience. People may be in senior roles, leading teams, really key employees that actually it's really important to retain and also attract. We know there are lots of challenges around recruitment and retention at the moment. So being able to recognise this is one of the fastest growing workforce demographics in the UK. So by putting the things in place that both retain that important talents, but also attract new talent into the organisation is just a really big priority.
Absolutely, Sally. I mean, that's really helpful. And we're going to go on to talk about a bit later about how we can help the workplace be more menopause friendly. But an important step in that is talking about it. So what can get in the way of talking about menopause at work?
Yeah, and this is I think one of the biggest challenges we've been looking. There was quite a lot of research last year and the year before from things like the Fawcett Society and Standard Chartered, and that culture of this still feeling a subject that has a lot of stigma, a lot of taboo. So one of the things I'd just like to ask is you to pop in chat what words you associate with menopause. So if someone stopped you in the street, said the word menopause to you, what automatically springs to mind? And there's no right or wrong answers here. We just want to hear all those words that we naturally think of when we hear that word menopause. So just give a moment to allow people to.
There's a little bit of a delay. They'll
start coming. To come through now. Yeah.
They're coming.
Yeah, hot flushes, I think absolutely is the most common thing associated. Things that we avoid. Old. How much of menopause association is with age? Brain fog, anxiety, tired, emotional, frustration, panic, end of periods, exhausting, freedom from periods. So for some, and again, we'll talk about this a bit more, the freedom from periods thing for some can be absolutely a celebration at that next stage of life. But again, depending where this happens and where people are in their life, that can be quite a grieving process that people go through. Hormones, middle age, relationship problems, no longer attractive, body out of balance, unwelcome time of working life, crazy women, stiffness, all sorts of things. So thank you. I can't read them all. I can't keep up, which is amazing.
It's so fast.
Exactly. The reason I ask that question is if what we generally associate with menopause is things like hot and tired and angry and old and emotional and past it and not attractive and all of those things, putting your hand up at work and saying, actually, do you know what? That's me. That can feel quite uncomfortable for people because of all of those associations. So one of the big things that we really like to focus organizations on is how can we change those perceptions of menopause? How can we change the way we think about people at this stage of life in the workplace? Because as I said, this is a really important part of our workforce. And if we change the way we think about this, we can actually approach it in a very, very different way. So I think that's probably the biggest barrier. Some of the shocking statistics around the impact of menopause at work is that 1 in 10, there's research from the Fawcett Society, 1 in 10 women have left work because of their menopause symptoms. It's a really significant number. Another researcher said 1 in 4 consider leaving. And when you talk to people about the reasons why, sometimes it's because they don't really know what's going on or what they can do about it. But sometimes it's because they just don't feel comfortable sharing that at work. They don't feel that they can talk to their manager about it. They can disclose this because it's going to reflect badly on their abilities and their opportunities for progression in an organization. And that's the thing we really want to try and change.
That's great, Sally. Thank you. And, these keep coming. Keep filling the chat with these. It's really interesting to hear what perceptions are. And also don't forget to vote in the poll. I should have told you all what the question was earlier. We're asking you, what has your organisation done so far to become menopause friendly? And there's a bunch of options there where you can vote. We will be talking a bit later about what more organisations can do, and hopefully you'll get some more ideas there of what you can do in the workplace as reps to help make a difference and make a change for the better for your colleagues. So my next question, Sally, how can a rep encourage or influence their employer that this is an important subject for discussion?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important, we work with a lot of organisations and the employee reps play a really important role in helping put this on the agenda, helping encourage organisations to provide that amazing support within the organisations. And I can start to see people voting through in the poll of things that have already starting to put in place, which is great. We find it's best to try and break it down, and we've got some resources that we'll share with you around what we call the compelling reasons. And we split it into 4 key areas: the demographic case, the business case, the legal case, and the social responsibility case. So the demographic case I've talked about a little bit already in terms of the age when this is most likely to impact, the fact that 8 out of 10 menopausal women are in work, from what our research tells us, and the amount of people that think about leaving work because of menopause. If you can make those demographics specific to your organisation, that can be really impactful to show the potential impact this is having. And it doesn't just need to be about those who are going through menopause directly. We did some work with one of the rail networks in the UK that are an 80% male workforce, and they provide a huge amount of education and support around menopause, identified from one of their train drivers saying, I'm really struggling because My partner is really struggling with menopause, not sleeping. It's interrupting both of our sleep. It's affecting our relationship, and it is having a really big impact on my well-being, my mental health at work. And so they looked at what they could do to provide support to both people going through menopause directly and also people that were supporting. And they looked at the age demographic of their organisation and realising that many people could be supporting someone through menopause as well as people going through. So that's one area. From a business point of view, we've seen, as well as improving that retention and attraction that we spoke about, it also can have a really big impact on improving performance and motivation and reducing absenteeism and reducing presenteeism, where people are dragging themselves into work and thinking, rather than trying to tackle or deal with what they might be going through. And the way menopause education helps with that is, as I said, a big reason why people sometimes leave the workforce is because they don't know what's going on. We speak to so many people who said, I wish I'd known, I wish someone had told me that this was normal, that this was something that other people are going through, and actually that there are lots of things I can do to manage this. And so by providing that education as an organisation, it allows individuals to understand what's going on for them and how do they access the help and support they need to be able to manage their symptoms, which can have a really big positive impact at work. From a legal point of view, and I'm not going to go into the legal case in a huge amount of detail, but there have been some successful tribunal cases in the UK over the last few years. It's becoming more common topic. It's being talked about a lot in Parliament, and there's been big discussion around should legislation change to support menopause. But there are kind of three key messages that are coming through from the tribunal case law that's being started, that body of case laws being created. The first is about treating people as individuals. There's a case where a manager made assumptions around the experience of someone's menopause based on his wife's menopause and said, well, my wife didn't experience any of those symptoms, so I didn't believe them. And obviously that's really shocking behaviour, but it came from that place of ignorance. So the education of managers can really have a positive impact on recognising everyone's journey through menopause is really very different. So having that understanding and treating people as individuals. The other thing is around the way we talk about menopause, and I saw a few bits in the chats earlier. Ensuring it's spoken about in a respectful way, so it doesn't become the butt of jokes. It's not a derogatory term, and so people can feel comfortable and confident if they need to share, they need to ask for help and support. They can do so without fears of feeling embarrassed or humiliated. And when we work with organisations, we talk about the collective responsibility we all have in the way a topic is spoken about. And again, thinking how you can influence your organisation to call out when this isn't being spoken about in that respectful way. And the final bit then, that social responsibility case, it is the right thing to do. We all want to ensure anyone in our workplace is able to be at their best, is able to thrive at work, and we really see menopause is a part of supporting that. So one of the resources we'll share following the session, we've got those 4 compelling reasons with some key statistics, and those can be a really great way to be able to influence your organisation why this is a priority.
Thanks, Sally. That was a great summary of the ways people can influence their employers in this area. So, can you please just tell us what are the key things we should all know about menopause? A few key facts so that we can take away with either a bit more knowledge about it or just to confirm the knowledge we've already got, please.
Absolutely. I think the key things we always say is understanding the ages, stages, and symptoms. Those are the 3 key bits. And if we can understand those, it makes a big difference to the way we can support menopause. So we've already talked about the average age, and it's important to understand averages because it gives us the most likely time that menopause is going to be impacting. But actually, menopause can happen at any time. And that can happen naturally through things like premature ovarian insufficiency. So people in their mid-20s, as young as in their teenage years, could be going through menopause. Now, those younger years are rare, but it can happen. So we need to appreciate and not make assumptions of the age that people could be experiencing this. Some people may come to menopause earlier as well because of things like surgery, so hysterectomy, oophorectomy, or certain types of cancer treatment. So again, not making assumptions that this is a natural process, because actually for some, it doesn't feel like a natural process because the body's being pushed into menopause because of the surgery, because of the medication. So understanding that the age of menopause, that we should never make any assumptions. When it comes to stages, we often get asked, well, what does menopause actually mean? So menopause from a clinical point of view is actually considered to be a one-day event. So once someone hasn't had a period for 12 months, is said to have reached menopause. Now, anyone going through it, supporting anyone through it, we know that's not the whole story. So we have this period of perimenopause, and that's that time where hormones are starting to fluctuate and change. And that's said to last on average 5 to 7 years, can be shorter, can be longer, and very different for everybody. And then we have postmenopause, and postmenopause is from the following day, someone's considered to be postmenopausal. But it's fine using menopause as the umbrella term, but just the recognition of the stages. And then from a symptoms point of view, we saw loads that were shared at the beginning in the words that we associate with menopause to see the really diversity of symptoms people can experience. So we've got the physical symptoms, hot flushes, we tend to know about, but achy joints, changes to hair and skin, some of the more embarrassing and maybe difficult to deal with symptoms, in particular work. So things like heavy flooding periods, and that can be really, say, hard depending on the work environment somebody's in. But the psychological symptoms now are getting much more recognition and understanding around things like anxiety, low mood, feeling really irritable and frustrated about things. And we hear from people saying, I just don't feel like me anymore. And that's a really hard thing to deal with in the workplace. And what we recognize as well is how symptoms tend to influence each other. So if someone's struggling with night sweats and not sleeping, they're then exhausted and tired. Their brain fog can feel worse because we all know when we don't sleep, we find things much harder. So that concentration, and then that feel of, am I making mistakes, or am I not doing things as well as I could do, that loss of confidence. And then that can start to cause anxiety when people are maybe trying to go to sleep and stopping people from sleeping. So what I would say for anyone that's going through this, if you're supporting anyone going through this, the most important thing is for someone to be really clear on their symptoms, because that can inform diagnosis, it can inform good conversations with the GP, and it can inform decisions around what treatment options. And that's the key thing for anyone going through this, to get really specific about their symptoms.
Thanks, Sally. That's really helpful. Just before we go on to the next question, I noticed that a lot of people in the chat are talking about sharing policies that their workplace has got. What I'm going to suggest is that I think it was Lucinda maybe who said they could share their policy. If you're happy to, rather than get everyone's email address, and you start sharing things on this broadcast, if you send the policy to us, TUC Education at tuc.org.uk, we will include a link to it in the resources that get sent out to everyone who's registered to attend today. But thank you for those who are also sharing links in the chat. That's really helpful. Right. Our next question is about practical things that reps can do in the workplace. So what my question is, what can organizations do to support menopause or become a more menopause-friendly organization? And these are by default what reps can encourage their organizations to do, and can get on the discussion agenda, really. So sorry, off you go, Sally.
No, absolutely. I think it's because we want to think about what can we actually do, and just reading in the chat some of the things there around where people need to see their GP, or some of the symptoms could be signs of other things. That is one of the biggest things we can do, is encourage people to feel empowered to be able to get the help and support they need. And that can be different for everyone, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the key things, again, we break this down, and we've got a menopause-friendly checklist, which we will share with you as well as part of the resources. And it's a way of almost creating a roadmap of things that you may already have in your organization, and other things that you might want to think about. So the first area, and it's great people are sharing around their policies and guidance documents. And to us, it's not about whether it's a policy, whether it's a guidance document, it's about setting out how as an organization you are supporting people through menopause. And most importantly, then, how is that lived and how is that communicated? Because having a great looking policy or a really well written policy is only as good as then the reality of how that's lived as an experience for people in the organization. We did some work with one organization where we were doing a session which was just a general public session, and somebody was saying how little support there was in their organization. They didn't know where to turn, and the conversation kind of got going, and they eventually said which organization they worked for. And we knew that organization did a huge amount around menopause, but for whatever reason it hadn't reached this individual. And when we put that person in touch with what the support that was available, they were really blown away by what was there, but they just hadn't known. So for that organization, a real wake-up call to say, we've got these great things, but if people don't know about them, they can't then access that support. So having a well-written policy or guidance or whatever's appropriate for your organization is great, and a really great sign that the organization is taking this seriously, but then also thinking about how do you communicate and how do you make that a lived experience. And that really fits into the culture of the organization. Do you have a culture where menopause is talked about openly? I always like to share a story of someone I worked with who worked in an engineering company, and she was really struggling with symptoms where she was finding her kind of brain fog and concentration and recall of information was just having such a big impact for her. And she was getting to the stage of just thinking of leaving, because she said, I'm sure I'm going to make some big mistake. I'm going to damage all the reputation I've put into developing my career. And then I'm going to, maybe if I take some time out, come back at a later stage. And I asked her if she talked to her manager about it. And she hadn't, because she said, in my organization, I don't think I've ever heard the word menopause be mentioned. I have no idea how to even start that conversation. And we talked through how to have the conversation. She did. She was brave. She talked to her manager, and the manager was actually incredibly supportive. But if she hadn't taken that brave step in being almost the first person in that organization to talk about it, she potentially could have left a job she loved, and the organization could have lost someone they really didn't want to lose just because the conversation wasn't happening. So thinking about how, as a rep, you can influence that this becomes a normal conversation. We worked with a chief nurse in the NHS, and she was saying she knew they'd made a difference when she was doing a ward round, and there was one of the nurses and somebody from the maintenance team, and the nurse said, just bear with me a minute, I'm having a really bad hot flush, I'm just going to go and step outside for a minute. And the guy was just like, okay, that's fine. It was just a normal everyday conversation. So thinking how that culture change can happen in your organization. Training is a big part, and there's lots of different considerations around training. And training can be the form of a training session, but equally it can be great intranet content. It can be through lunch and learns with things like support groups and menopause cafes. It's, again, what's appropriate for your organization. But key groups of people, making sure there's general awareness for everybody, making sure there's understanding and awareness for managers. That often seems to be the place where organizations aren't quite sure how to help their managers feel confident in having those conversations. HR and occupational health, and then making sure senior leaders are really engaged in this. And then internal support, and I know I've seen some amazing things around Menopause Cafe and support groups coming through in chat. Those peer support groups, as with many other topics, really helpful. That safe space for people to be able to share their experiences, to learn from each other, to know they're not on their own in the organisation. And again, if an organisation can help facilitate that happening, shows the importance and the recognition that this is something that people may need that peer support around. And we find those support groups are often really led by really passionate individuals, whether they've got their own personal story or they've supported. So we've got some amazing male advocates in some of our organisations where they've been through a really challenging time supporting a partner, and they really want to engage everyone in talking about this conversation. And then there are some practical things from a facilities point of view. So looking at the facilities and the workspace that people are working in. Again, research talks around the impact of symptoms at work, but equally the impact of work on symptoms. And if you're thinking around the different roles that you have within your organisations, what are some of the workplace environments that might be causing more challenges, and different roles have different restrictions around the environment people are working in, and having an understanding. This is where working with people like occupational health, working with facilities teams and influencing them as to what they can do. Again, another example where this didn't go quite so well is in one organisation, they had a facility where people could order a desk fan as a stationary order, so really easy, simple process, and they could plug a USB into their system. And facilities made a decision that they wanted to manage the air conditioning in the building, and so they decided, as a blanket policy, no desk fans were allowed to be used, and they removed them from everyone's desks with no consultation, no notification, because they had no understanding of the reasons why. And so, well, we've got air conditioning, why do people need that? So again, trying to think who needs to be involved in this subject so they can have an influence. And things like workwear as well. And again, changes to things like uniform, that can be sometimes quite a lengthy process or a costly process, may not always be possible, but considerations around providing additional sets of uniform, safe places for people to be able to get changed if they need to. Thinking about if there are changes to uniform or workwear happening, talking with suppliers around breathable fabrics, alternatives for people. So again, just that consideration of what is possible. And often when those conversations happen, more is possible than we might think. So again, just thinking all of those different people that could have an influence on the things that could have a positive impact on what people are experiencing. So
thanks, Sally. Yeah,
quite a lot there.
Hugely comprehensive list covering, most recently the practicality side of things, but also focusing on the bigger policy guidance and other things that reps can do, culture training, etc. I think lots of people have been talking about both sides of that in the chat, both the practical and the policy side of things. And we know as workplace reps, getting a good workplace policy in place, whatever it's about, menopause or 10 other issues, the important thing is to get the policy in place, and also to review it regularly, make sure it's working, and to make sure it's getting used and people know about it, so that it can be put into effect well and make a difference for people. Someone's just asked speakers' names. I'm Anna, and Sally Leech is here from Henpicked. So I'm going to now look at some of the questions we've had posted, or we had some sent in advance. First question, Sally. Can you talk a little bit about perhaps the education sector? It's a little, maybe some of the adjustments that might be able to be made there. We know that education has perhaps a higher percentage of women working in that area, and also rooms with little kids can't always step outside, like the example you gave. So it would be good to hear about some ideas for that area, please.
Absolutely, and I think education, it is a real challenge. We've done quite a lot of work with academy trusts, and it's really interesting when you've got people in a more head office role to teachers on the front line, and the differences, flexible workings, changing in starting hours, changing breaks and lunches. That's really, really difficult in a school environment. Again, education is a big piece. So making sure that individuals who are going through this have got a really good understanding of what might be going on for them. Have they got the resources available to them to be able to advocate for themselves in terms of what treatment might feel right, or what they can do themselves to be managing symptoms. Because, again, as much as the conversation in the UK has opened up a lot, it's amazing the amount of people that we still speak to that say, I just haven't got a clue. I just feel awful and I don't know where to start. I think it's then talking through how this is happening for an individual. So it's a really individual case. So in one school we worked with, there was one individual that was really struggling in terms of needing to go to the loo much more regularly, and in particular finding it difficult when she was dealing with things like heavy flooding periods, going to the toilet at the same time as all other teachers. And so they talked this through with their manager, and they just organised that on days when she needed to, she could leave the classroom 5 minutes earlier than normal break time, with cover organised, so that she was able to then access those toilet facilities on her own, feeling really comfortable. And it's a small change. And yes, it is a change. Yes, there's cover needed, and that's not always possible. But actually the difference that made to that teacher, she was getting to that stage where I can't keep doing this. And so potentially they could have had someone that's taking time off sick, or they could have had someone thinking about leaving, but that small change made a difference. One of the other things we see as well in teaching is a lot of communication in schools can be where one of the examples was one of the teachers said, I always catch up with the head teacher and we're walking down the corridor and we share loads of things and things I need to go and do, and I can't write them down. And then I get back to my classroom and I can't remember what we said. So putting in place real communication structures, making sure things are followed up with email, making sure somebody's in their classroom with able to write down notes, small things. And one teacher in particular we worked with around that said, by having that conversation with the head teacher and the head teacher recognising that and changing slightly the way they communicated, felt like she had this safety net at work of someone who'd listened and understood. And it's just a small change, but made the world of difference. So the biggest impact is those individual conversations to understand how is this affecting an individual, and what practical solutions could be put in place that are realistic in the environment they work in. Because most teachers know what's possible and what's not. They're in that environment all the time.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sally. And some of the viewers have been saying that the NEU has some good information on this issue. We'd expect them to. The biggest education union for teachers in England, at least. Okay, we've had quite a few questions as well about absence policy, sickness absence policies. Have you got any information or advice as to how menopause should be handled in this area in relation to sickness absence, or any experience of dealing with this, please?
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation we've done in our menopause-friendly membership. We've done think tanks on how do you manage absence and record absence around menopause. And so in some organizations we've seen it been done really successfully, where they've actually had menopause as an absence reason, but actually broken it down into specific things that people are experiencing because of that, because then it's actually then relating to one issue for the reasons why someone's absent, rather than lots of individual absences. Thames Valley Police have done some really great work around this, and by putting that in not just as menopause as this headline, actually breaking it down into some of the things people might be experiencing. Because of that, they've actually had really high levels of reporting, because one of the things is sometimes putting a reason in is great, but if in the culture of the organisation no one wants to say that they're going through menopause, or no one wants to say that's the reason why they're off, then it looks like there's no issue. And we've seen in some organisations they've introduced the reason, no one's recording it, saying, well, we've not got any issues around absence and menopause, but actually that's not the case. It's just a hidden issue. So it's something that needs to be really carefully thought about, and having a way of understanding how menopause is impacting absence that's right for your organisation, and making it okay for people to say that is the reason they're off, and helping managers to understand the impact that that's having, and how those absences are related together rather than, say, lots of different reasons for absence. But it's a complicated area, and it's not a one size fits all. It's got to be how that fits within your organisation. But first of all, that culture change where it's okay to talk about menopause will make a big difference to how comfortable people feel sharing and disclosing.
Thank you, Sally. I hope that's helpful. I realise it's not like a definitive answer, because we obviously know that every employer is different and every situation is different, but hopefully that's given some guidance. Okay, next question. Can you talk a bit more, please, about how menopause intersects? So perhaps both on ethnicity dimension, and we also had a question about how the menopause can how people with disabilities might experience that differently as well. So I've put two questions in one there, really.
Yeah.
So disability and then other intersections, please.
Yeah, and there's a lot of considerations and complexities in the way people experience menopause, and lots of different things that can influence that. So from an ethnicity point of view, if we think in general around health inequalities, how comfortable people are talking about subjects like menopause. So we need to be really sensitive to, we always talk about meeting people where they are in terms of how comfortable they feel talking about this. And this is where providing lots of different ways to access support becomes important, because for some people, talking openly about what they're experiencing, going to a support group or attending a training session will just not feel that that's something they want to do in the workplace. But great signposting, great intranet information, acknowledgement that this is something they could be going through, can actually go a long way to making someone feel supported. But recognizing that, in certain cultures, talking about something like menopause is just not something that you would do, certainly not in the workplace. We did some work with the University of Bradford, where we were looking at, we did a big education campaign, and they were then starting to look at, well, who's joining in this conversation and who's not? What are the barriers? And we worked with one of their ERGs, and one of the big barriers was we were having mixed gender sessions, and in certain cultures, talking about something like menopause in a mixed gender environment was just considered to be unacceptable. So we needed to put on some female-only sessions, and also helping to facilitate conversations in the language people felt most comfortable sharing their experiences in. So providing information, but then facilitating conversations in Urdu and Punjabi, and allowing people to share those experiences so that they felt this conversation was something they could be part of. And so it's really, really important to think wider than that typical image you tend to see of somebody going through menopause. And it is, if we look at what's covered in the media, it's generally a white heterosexual couple where hot flushes are the only symptom, and it's just not the reflection of reality. Around disability and neurodiversity, really, again, important to have an understanding that this can often either exacerbate symptoms. We've done some work where a lot of women are being diagnosed with ADHD later in life as they are, and this often intersects around the time of menopause. We're doing a research project with the University of Bournemouth at the moment around menopause and autism, and understanding how this may manifest and show itself. So again, from an organisation point of view, thinking about all the different barriers and challenges and differences in the way people could be experiencing this. And then whatever support is in place, having those different lenses to think, how can we ensure that anyone that's experiencing these symptoms at work feels they're able to access support that feels appropriate and right for them. And so it's a really important consideration. And the language we use as well around the way we talk around menopause. You know, we need to recognise not everyone who goes through menopause identifies as female. So again, thinking about ensuring the language we use is inclusive, the imagery and the way we talk about menopause, so that anyone feels they can identify with what we're sharing, what we're talking about.
That was going to be my next question, Sally. How can reps ensure that a policy or any guidance is trans inclusive? You've just mentioned a couple of things there around language or imagery, but is there anything else that can be added to that?
I think it's important that it's really it's not just implied in the policy; it's actually talked about, because as an example, a trans man who's gone through something like a hysterectomy, the challenges around the symptoms that they could be experiencing that are often following hysterectomy symptoms can be really sudden, really really quite severe, because this is a huge change in the body. But menopause is something that we associate as being something that women go through. And if that's not how you identify, actually accessing support, talking about this, disclosing what's going on, that can be a real challenge. So I think being very clear in the policy that this is a policy that is for anybody that is experiencing these symptoms, and that as an organisation the priority is helping people find the support that's right for them, and linking in with other policies, but also talking to your ERGs and understanding, talking to people who are maybe experiencing this, and understanding what people want. Because I think that's very much our learning when we're working with organisations, is talking to different groups, talking to different people across the organisation, to keep learning and keep understanding, are we reaching everyone? And if we're not reaching everyone, what are those barriers, and how can we start to keep trying to remove those?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Sally. Thank you. We all know, we always say on our webinars, the workplace reps, talk to your members. I would say it's like reps bread and butter. Talk to your members, map the workplace, find out what people's issues are, what they need, what they want to see in a policy. And if you talk to people, and obviously part of that is making sure that the culture is comfortable and that people feel able to talk about these things. But if you talk to your members, you'll be able to represent those issues, I think more easily and more successfully. Okay, we've had a couple of questions that point out that often the experiences of menopause are quite different. Every situation is different. Each individual is different. Some people have an easier time than others, and they aren't always supportive to those who might be having a harder time. How can we help people take this seriously, who might be a little bit less understanding than perhaps would be helpful?
Yeah, and it is really hard. And I think because we often get asked, well, is it, do we find, who do we find more supportive around menopause? And it's so different around the individual. And we often get a mixture of people who've maybe been through menopause and it didn't really affect them, because 1 in 4 do go through menopause without affecting them. And they can be, well, I got through it fine. Or other people who had a really tough time but didn't have the help and support, because this is now really a conversation that's only just starting to open up, and very much, well, I went through it and I just had to get on with it, so everyone should do. I think the theme of International Women's Day this year around equity is quite a good way of really trying to land the importance of providing support that's right for an individual. Because just because 2 people are experiencing menopause in very different ways, it doesn't mean they need the same support or in the same way as anything else. Some people will have really challenging mental health issues, other people won't, but you wouldn't question providing support for somebody who's having a mental health challenge and not providing that same for somebody who isn't. But because this conversation is still quite new, people find that quite challenging to say, well, I went through it fine, and people just need to get on with it. And this is that thing of equity, of understanding, well, everyone's not at the same starting point, everyone's not got the same reference point. So the big thing is actually using some of those statistics to demonstrate that 3 in 4 people going through menopause do experience symptoms. 1 in 4 experience serious symptoms, and those symptoms can have a really big impact on quality of life. And actually giving some examples, especially if story sharing is so incredibly powerful. If you've got people in your organisation that are willing to share their experiences, that can often really help to highlight the realities for somebody. And in particular, where we've had people who have been less empathetic, when they've actually heard that story from an individual and start to think, okay, if I was experiencing that, I'd be really struggling. And it's those personal stories, and that can be from senior leaders who are willing to share their stories, and we've seen that work very successfully. I always like sharing. We did a session with an NHS trust, and it was a senior female leader. It was a big conference, and at the beginning of her address, she was saying, well, before we go into this, I just want to say I'm having a really bad menopause day. If I start getting really hot, or if I forget my words, this is the reason why. And she described it as almost this collective sigh of relief of everyone in the organization thinking, wow, it's okay. I can talk about this now. So those things can make a big difference to really influencing those people who don't feel as, or don't seem as empathetic. And we will always have those people. But what we find is the more momentum you can gather in an organization, almost people get to the stage, well, I really need to join in this because this is now a common thing we talk about, and I can start to see the impact this is having. But it does take time to change the mindsets of people.
Yeah, I think that's helpful advice, Sally. We're not going to be able to make a change in all of these things tomorrow, but we can certainly start to and take steps towards to. Okay, got a little bit of a legal question next. From a discrimination point of view, would menopause fall under disability or sex discrimination? Just interested to hear what has been done so far in this area, if anything.
Yeah, so it's the three protected characteristics that have been quoted in tribunals around sex, age, and disability. And disability is the one often people say, kind of question, why would it be disability? And it's about that definition of disability under the Equality Act. It's not saying menopause is a disability, but the severity, the symptoms for some people, the length of time they're expected to last could then meet that definition of disability. And there have been successful claims under that where the symptoms someone's experienced were considered to amount to a disability, but the organisation wasn't, and looking at the reasonable adjustments or support that they could put in place that was considered to be reasonable for that employer, and really dismissing those symptoms. So that's where we've seen cases around sex and age discrimination and harassment, in particular where people are using menopause in a derogatory way. There's one case where an individual had shared with their manager that they were experiencing menopause, the symptoms they were experiencing, and the manager then used that information to really humiliate them in front of colleagues, in front of customers. It's really not a nice tribunal read. But it came again from that place of not understanding the impact, and that culture within that organisation was that behaviour was kind of just accepted, acknowledged. Well, that's just the way we talk about it, and so it can be considered under a sex and age, but also disability. And this has been a big debate in Parliament, whether menopause should be an additional protected characteristic. At the moment, the feedback is that that's not going to happen, but it's still bubbling on the agenda. The question and challenge is, if it became a protected characteristic, is how do we define what is menopause? Because one of the challenges around menopause is diagnosing, because the diagnosis is based on symptoms rather than blood tests for the majority of people. So that then becomes quite a complex area. But it's interesting listening from an organisation perspective, is actually many of the organisations we talk to say it's not about needing further legislation. Actually, what they need is support, and they need education, and they need information, and that is that driving force. And to us, the business case, the demographic case, the social responsibility case are such strong drivers. The legal case is there as a support for people, but actually the other reasons are really compelling for organisations.
Thanks, Sally. We've talked quite a lot about how it's important to get this as a subject that's talked about, right, and get the discussion going. So one of the viewers has asked, how can we get men or people who don't experience menopause involved in these discussions? Have you got any examples of this working? They would really like to hear some good practice, guidance, or different approaches. And actually, Sally, I'm going to ask that to our viewers as well. If you've got any good examples, please share them.
Yeah.
But while you're adding them, we'll hear from Sally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, learning from other organisations is always, and sharing from other reps and things, I think that's really, really important. One of the best examples is Thames Valley Police again, who Natasha, who kind of led their program, she said she went out and found what she describes who were her rock stars in the organization who could potentially have a really big influence. And she found some really great male allies. She found some really great younger members of the team who were really passionate about supporting this. And they actually shared their stories as to why they felt this was important. So it wasn't coming from the perspective of the organization. It was an individual who was a male ally or an individual who was younger. We did some work with a recruitment company as well, where they encourage all of their staff to attend a session on menopause. And one of the younger members who were only in her 20s, she'd kind of turned up and she said openly, she said, I really don't know why I'm here. I don't think this is anything relevant to me at all. And at the end of the session, she's going, I can't believe how much I've learned, how much I didn't know. And she then wrote a blog, which was shared across the organization, about what she'd learned and why she felt it was important for everyone at any age to experience that. So people of a younger age were being spoken to by someone of their age that was saying why this was important. And I think getting messages from people who really represent the people you want to be involved in this conversation is a great way of influencing that.
Yeah, absolutely. People are mentioning some ideas in the chat panel, which I think is really helpful. I'm quite surprised this is the first time we've seen the mention of Davina McCall's TV programs, which were hugely popular, weren't they, and very widely watched, and really got this to be a talking point. That's a great suggestion of how to get the conversation started. Okay, I've got another question for you, Sally, and for the viewers. What suggestions have you got for how you get these policies through? And by through, we mean like through the system, through negotiations, and actually out there, agreed in practice. What should reps be doing to sort of drive this forward, other than keep talking about it? You know, what other things can they do?
Yeah, I think the keep talking about it is obviously the key thing. I think it's understanding who are the key influencers in your organization. So, and who have been helpful in getting other things through. So who are the people you know you need to get on board with this as a priority, and think about how you can really use some of the data and the information to influence them. So you've not the kind of the earlier you can start to consult with people, you can start to bring people into this so they feel part of creating and developing that, rather than it suddenly being this is something that needs signing off and they've not had any part in it, or they've not had any understanding of the why. We see that's often that barrier for people. So it's kind of starting with that why and starting influencing as early as possible into the process, and thinking who are all your key stakeholders and who do you need to get involved in this so that they can feel confident and comfortable. And I think then it's the making sure you're getting out any objections to any parts of the policy as early as possible, because again, we've worked with organizations where we've helped develop policies, and you kind of get to that stage where you think, right, we're last bits of proofreading and signing off, and then suddenly somebody joins the conversation that hadn't been part of it, saying, well, actually, hang on a minute, I think we need to be thinking about this, or I don't think this bit's right. So trying to make sure we've got all of those people involved as early as possible is definitely, and using then the data to help influence the why.
That's really helpful, thank you. And hopefully that people will be able to take those forward to push these policies through and get them up and running. Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more question. What suggestions do you have for moving menopause-friendly workplaces beyond discussing symptoms?
Yeah, and I think that's really important to, I would say the first thing is, from those discussions of symptoms, what would people like to see as different within the organization? I've seen quite a few people showing around champions and advocates and people within their organization. It's amazing the roles that they can play, because they, in champions in particular, we've seen in organizations, and they are in their roles, they're kind of on the ground, they're on, you know, we talk about word on the street and actually understanding what actually is happening for people, what are the things that are making a difference. But I think the big thing for me of changing from switching from just about symptoms is really challenging those perceptions. So we do an exercise in our training where we do exactly what we asked at the beginning, those words you associate with menopause. And yeah, exactly the kind of words that you would expect. And then we start to really kind of challenge back to say, well, actually, if you look around your organization at the people who are potentially going through this, I think there's a really different set of words we would use to describe. People are knowledgeable, they're experienced, they're capable, they're wise. We ran a session where we asked the question around what words would you associate with menopause, or how would you describe yourself going through menopause? And someone shouted out the word fabulous, and completely different words we normally hear. And she'd had a really tough time through menopause, but she said, you know what, I'm dealing with my symptoms, I'm working with my GP. I've seen quite a few comments around GP. We know there are a lot of challenges around that, and I completely understand the frustrations that sometimes people can feel. They were working with their manager, and they said on top of everything else they were dealing with, you know what, I am fabulous. And she said for her, that change in mindset made her not just focus on those symptoms, not just focus on the hard bits. It was actually, you know, this is a phase of life. This is then looking forward to that next stage of life, rather than it just being focused on the challenging parts. And we did some work with an organization where their senior female leaders shared their stories. And one in particular was asked what menopause was like for them. They described it as just the wonkiest journey ever, which I think is a really great description. But at the end of their video, they wanted to get a really clear message across. I'm still going to do a really good job. I might need to do things slightly differently. I may need some support, but I'm still really capable. I've got a huge amount to offer this organization, and I'm still going to do a really good job. So finding those people that can share that positive message that, yes, this can be a challenging time. We need to acknowledge that. But actually, these are incredibly amazing people within our organization that we want to retain, we want to attract. And that change in perception is the best way of moving it, just from being a negative, and these are the challenging symptoms.
I love those examples there. They're really positive and affirmative, aren't they, going forward? I've got one which I think is going to be a really quick question. A viewer's asked, where's the best place to get data? I'm assuming this meaning some of the statistics you were giving us at the beginning. I would assume it's on your website. Is that correct? Yep. We will send a link to this later. Anyone who's registered for today, we'll send a link to the recording. We'll send a link to all the resources that Sally has mentioned, along with some others, and all the statistics and the data that Sally has referred to will be included in that. I hope that that is what the data you were talking about. Okay, we've really covered a huge amount today. I really hope everybody has enjoyed it and has found it as interesting as I have. Thank you for all of the fabulous, absolutely right, Sam, fabulous chat and suggestions, and all the great information from Sally. Remember, if you attended live on this webinar, we will be recognising that with a digital credential, which we'll send you either later today or tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again in a few weeks for another webinar. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.